Some places simply refused to be ruled. Across thousands of years, the world's greatest empires stretched their armies and their laws to the farthest corners of the map. Yet certain stubborn zones, these ancient borderlands, broke them every time. This was not about empty wilderness, but about dynamic spaces where geography, culture, and sheer human will collided to shape history itself. By the end, you will understand the hidden rules that made these lands unconquerable and what their enduring defiance teaches us about the very nature of power. Why did the same mountains and deserts defeat empire after empire, from Rome to Persia? What does it mean when the map of control has permanent holes punched right through it? How do you think a civilization decides where its ambition finally has to end? To understand these zones of defiance, we first need to clear up a common misunderstanding. A borderland is not just a line on a map, a distant frontier waiting to be crossed and claimed. That is a temporary boundary, a place where an empire pauses to gather its strength before pushing onward. The borderlands we are talking about are something else entirely. They are not pauses, they are permanent puzzles. Think of them as vast, living arenas where worlds collide. Here, geography is not just a backdrop, it is an active player, with mountains that sever supply lines and deserts that swallow whole armies. The people who live here are often mobile, their loyalties shifting like the sands or the seasons, making them impossible to pin down under a single flag. This creates a zone of intense interaction where cultures mix and clash, where trade and conflict are two sides of the same coin, and where political power is always negotiated, never absolute. Many frontiers in history were eventually absorbed, their names fading into the provinces of a larger state. But a true historical borderland remains a stubborn blank space in the story of empire, a hole that no amount of ambition can seem to stitch closed. For our journey, we will focus on regions that meet two crucial tests. First, they were targeted repeatedly by major, neighboring civilizations, each believing they could succeed where others failed. And second, they demonstrated a consistent, centuries-long pattern of resisting that control, of maintaining a fierce and resilient autonomy. These are the places where the map, no matter who drew it, was always forced to admit its own limits. Our first case study takes us into a rugged, windswept landscape of immense historical weight. The Anatolian Highlands, the mountainous heart of modern Turkey, were once the core of the Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower that rivaled Egypt and Babylon. This was a civilization of formidable chariot armies and sophisticated diplomacy, whose kings commanded respect across the ancient Near East. Yet, right at the center of their own domain lay a problem they could never solve. The empire's northern frontiers, a tangled maze of forested hills and narrow valleys, were home to independent groups known as the Kaskians. These were not a unified nation with a single capital to conquer, but a loose collection of mobile, hill-dwelling communities. They lived in a way that made them nearly invisible to a traditional army. When Hittite forces marched north in their heavy, slow-moving columns, the Kaskians would simply melt into the highland forests. They avoided large, set-piece battles, instead relying on swift raids, ambushes along mountain passes, and a deep knowledge of terrain that imperial soldiers could never match. For the Hittite state, this created a perpetual, draining cycle. Each new king, upon taking the throne, would often be forced to launch a costly campaign into the highlands, not to expand the empire, but simply to reclaim territory and subjects lost during the previous reign. These expeditions were a massive logistical strain, consuming grain, livestock, and military manpower that could have been used to secure richer prizes elsewhere. Victory, when it came, was always temporary. The Hittites might burn a few villages and force a momentary submission, but as soon as the royal army marched home, the Kaskians would re-emerge, their autonomy intact. This endless, simmering conflict on the empire's very doorstep became a constant drain on Hittite stability, a bleeding wound that never healed. It is a profound lesson in the limits of imperial power. Here was a civilization capable of projecting its might across hundreds of miles, signing treaties with pharaohs, yet utterly unable to impose its will on the stubborn, fragmented communities living in its own backyard. The pattern is clear, and it is not unique to Anatolia. From these ancient highlands, we see a template of resistance that would be repeated with astonishing consistency wherever mountains met ambition. This same story of highland defiance played out just to the east, with even greater consequences for world history. For over 2,000 years, the Zagros Mountains stood as a towering, jagged wall along the eastern flank of Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization. To the empires that rose from the fertile river plains below, from ancient Sumer and Akkad to the mighty Assyria and Babylon, the Zagros were more than just a scenic backdrop. They were a perpetual thorn, a zone of chaos that no amount of imperial brilliance could ever fully pacify. The geography itself was a defender. These are not gentle hills, but a colossal belt of parallel ridges and deep, narrow valleys running for hundreds of miles. For a Mesopotamian army, a force built for open field battles and siege warfare, entering the Zagros was a nightmare. Narrow passes became perfect sites for ambush. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. There was no single capital to besiege, no open plain upon which to deploy their superior numbers. The mountains sheltered not just rugged terrain, but rugged societies. Independent kingdoms like Elam, based in what is now southwestern Iran, thrived in this environment. From their fortified highland centers, they could look down on the wealthy plains, launching raids for loot and captives, then vanishing back into their mountain strongholds where Mesopotamian kings could not effectively follow. The response from the plains was often one of overwhelming, calculated terror. The Assyrian Empire, perhaps history's first true military machine, became infamous for its campaigns into the Zagros. They would mount enormous expeditions, meticulously documented in stone reliefs and royal annals, boasting of cities burned, populations relocated, and rulers flayed. For a time, this brutal calculus worked. The threat of apocalyptic violence could force submission, extract tribute, and create a temporary quiet on the frontier. But it never, ever lasted. The moment Assyrian attention was diverted to a rebellion in Babylon or a war with Egypt, the highland kingdoms would reassert their independence. The mountains provided a sanctuary for recovery, a place where resistance could be nurtured until the next cycle began. This reveals a critical flaw in the imperial model. Empires are built on administration, on taxation, on the steady extraction of resources through a controlled bureaucracy. The Zagros, with its fragmented landscape and mobile populations, was fundamentally unadministrable. You could terrorize it, you could raid it, but you could not build a lasting provincial government there. So it remained, century after century, a permanent hole in the map of Mesopotamian control, a place where the writ of the king from the plains simply did not run. It was a lesson written in stone and blood, one that the next great empire to the west would learn in its own harsh mountain school. While mountains presented walls of stone, another type of borderland offered a different kind of barrier, one of emptiness and endless horizon. To the west of Mesopotamia and the Zagros, the vast Syrian desert stretched out, a sea of rock and sand that formed the arid fringe of the Fertile Crescent. This was not a blank space on the map, but a dynamic interface, a permanent border between the sown land of farmers and the open realm of nomadic pastoralists. For the empires that rose around its edges, from Rome to Byzantium to the Persian Sassanids, this desert fringe presented a strategic puzzle they could never quite solve. The challenge was not a fortified city or a mountain stronghold, but a way of life. The desert was dominated by tribes who lived in constant motion, herding their sheep and goats and camels from one seasonal pasture to another. These communities, ancestors of the later Bedouin, had no single capital to conquer, no fields to burn, no fixed population to tax or control. Their center of gravity was the herd and the family unit, and both could vanish into the trackless expanse within days. An imperial army, a magnificent machine built for sieges and set battles, was utterly confounded here. Marching a legion or a royal regiment into the desert was a logistical nightmare and a strategic dead end. You could not force a decisive engagement because there was nothing to engage. The enemy was not a place but a pattern of movement. You might occupy an oasis, but the tribes simply shifted their routes. You might win a skirmish, but they would dissolve and regroup far beyond your reach. This left the empires with a frustrating compromise. They could, and did, exert control over the desert's gateways, the glittering caravan cities like Palmyra that sat at the crossroads of trade. These urban centers could be fortified, garrisoned, and taxed. Their wealthy elites often cooperated with imperial powers, acting as middlemen between the desert and the sown land. But this control was always superficial, a thin veneer over a deeper reality. The moment the imperial garrison looked away or the flow of tribute was interrupted, the desert's own logic reasserted itself. The tribes remained sovereign in their own domain, their loyalty negotiated through gifts and alliances, never commanded by decree. The Syrian desert fringe thus became a permanent seam in the fabric of empire, a space where political power was always fluid. It was a stark demonstration that control requires something to hold onto, and against a society built on mobility and dispersal, the heavy hand of empire simply found nothing to grasp. But if mountains and deserts were the ancient world's great dividers, then the Caucasus Range stands as their ultimate masterpiece. This is not merely a border, but a vertical world unto itself, a colossal stone fortress that has defied every empire that ever laid eyes on its slopes. Stretching between the Black and Caspian seas, these mountains are a chaos of sawtooth ridges, plunging gorges, and peaks that scrape the sky. This extreme topography did more than just hinder armies. It actively sculpted one of the most astonishing tapestries of human culture on Earth. In isolated valleys, separated by passes that were snowbound for most of the year, distinct communities developed in near-total solitude. This is why the Caucasus today is home to dozens of unique ethnic groups and language families found nowhere else, a living museum of human diversity forged by geographic isolation. For the great empires that encircled this fortress, it represented both a tantalizing prize and an impossible puzzle. To the south lay the Parthians and later the Sasanian Persians, masters of the Iranian plateau. To the west stood Rome and its eastern successor, Byzantium. All looked upon the Caucasus with strategic desire. It was the fabled gateway between the steppes of Eurasia and the civilized worlds of the Middle East and Mediterranean, a corridor through which nomadic invaders had historically poured. Controlling it meant locking a door against the unknown, and so they tried century after century. Roman legions pushed into the coastal lowlands of what is now Georgia, establishing forts and client kingdoms. Persian shahs sent royal armies north, demanding tribute and submission. Later, Byzantine emperors and Arab caliphs would continue the struggle, each pouring vast resources into the campaign. Yet their success was always and only partial. They could secure the narrow, strategic passes like the Darial Gorge, the famous Caspian Gates. They could control the fertile coastal plains and install puppet rulers in the lowland towns. But the true heart of the Caucasus, its labyrinthine interior highlands, remained utterly beyond their grasp. Societies like the Caucasian Albanians, or the ancestors of the Georgians and Armenians who retreated into mountainous citadels, were simply unreachable. An imperial army could not function in that terrain. Its supply trains would stall on goat trails, its formations would be shattered in ambushes from above, and there was never one central citadel to storm, only 100 independent villages clinging to the cliffsides. The Highlanders lived by a code of fierce local loyalty and clan honor that no imperial decree could overwrite. They would pay tribute 1 year to a Persian general, only to vanish back into the mist the next, their allegiance as fluid as the mountain weather. So the pattern held, immutable. The empires built their walls at the gates, but the fortress itself, with all its diverse and defiant peoples, remained sovereign. This was not a failure of imperial will, but a recognition of a fundamental truth that some landscapes are simply crafted to breed independence. And as we will see, this truth was not confined to the old world, but was waiting on an even vaster scale across the ocean. The story of unconquerable highlands finds a powerful echo far to the north, in the misty glens and rain-swept moors of Caledonia. For the Roman Empire, a civilization that had tamed continents, the rugged landscape of what is now Scotland represented a frontier where ambition finally met its match. This was not a war for glory or riches, but a grinding, costly struggle against a land and a people that refused to be shaped in Rome's image. The geography itself was a relentless adversary. Thick, trackless forests of pine and birch swallowed marching columns. Endless bogs and peat marshes could trap a man and his equipment in an instant. The climate, a cycle of chilling rain, dense fog, and bitter wind, was a constant drain on the morale and health of soldiers recruited from the sunny Mediterranean. An empire built on roads, aqueducts, and orderly farmland found itself in a world that seemed actively hostile to such order. The Roman military machine, the legendary legion, was a masterpiece of engineering and discipline designed for set-piece battles and siege warfare. It required open ground to form its famous shield walls, reliable supply lines to feed its thousands of men, and clear political targets like chieftain strongholds to besiege. In Caledonia, it found none of these. The tribes, groups like the Caledonii and the Meati, were decentralized and mobile. They did not fight in large, formal armies that could be decisively crushed. Instead, they mastered the art of the guerrilla campaign, using their profound knowledge of the terrain to launch lightning raids from the cover of the woods, then vanishing before a legion could respond. They would harass supply trains, ambush scouts, and strike isolated outposts, a strategy of 1,000 cuts against the Roman giant. This conflict reached a symbolic climax at the Battle of Mons Graupius, a victory the Romans claimed but which led to no lasting control. The cost of maintaining an army in such an unforgiving environment, so far from the empire's heart, became a crushing burden. The grain, timber, and manpower required to sustain the occupation yielded little in return. There were no great cities to tax, no vast mineral riches to exploit, only more rain, more forest, and more defiant tribes. This brutal calculus led to one of the ancient world's most profound strategic admissions, etched in stone across the width of Britain. Hadrian's Wall was not conceived as a temporary frontier line, a place to regroup before the next advance. It was a permanent statement. Its massive fortifications, mile castles, and garrison forts represented a conscious decision to draw a line, to say that the lands to the north were simply not worth the astronomical cost of full conquest. The wall did not keep the tribes out entirely. Trade and movement still occurred through its gates, but it formalized the Highlands as a permanent imperial borderland, a zone beyond direct control. It was Rome acknowledging that some landscapes and the fierce cultures they nurtured could not be absorbed, only contained. This lesson in the limits of power, written first in Anatolia and the Zagros, was now carved across the British countryside, proving that the rules of the borderland were universal. And as history turned its page, a new kind of empire would arise, one that seemed to defy these very rules, conquering the steppes themselves. Yet even here, in the endless grasslands, the ancient pattern of the borderland would re-emerge in a startling new form. But the ultimate test of this borderland principle may lie in the world's greatest desert. To the south of the Mediterranean's glittering cities, beyond the fertile coast of Roman North Africa, stretched the Sahara, a barrier so vast it seemed to mark the end of the world itself. Yet here, on the desert's very edge, we find one of history's most fascinating counterpoints to imperial power. The Roman frontier here, known as the Limes, was not a wall but a chain of forts and watchtowers gazing out over a sea of sand. These fortifications marked a clear, conscious limit. Behind them lay the provinces with their olive groves, wheat fields, and Roman law. Ahead lay a different realm entirely, a borderland where control was negotiated through diplomacy and trade, not legions. And at the heart of this independent zone flourished a civilization that turned the desert's harsh logic into a source of immense power. They were the Garamantes, based in the Fezzan region of modern Libya. Far from being simple nomads, they were oasis lords, master hydraulic engineers who tapped into ancient fossil water with deep, underground tunnels called fagaras to create a green archipelago in the desert. From their fortified cities like Garama, they commanded the early trans-Saharan trade routes, the vital arteries along which gold, ivory, slaves, and exotic animals moved north, while Mediterranean goods like glass and wine traveled south. To Rome, the Garamantes were not an enemy to be crushed, but a necessary and powerful neighbor. They existed in a state of complex relationship, sometimes as allied client kings, sometimes as raiders troubling the frontier, but always as an autonomous force. Roman expeditions occasionally pushed into their territory, but never with the goal of permanent conquest. The cost was too great, the environment too hostile for a lasting occupation. Instead, Rome's influence extended through a delicate web of alliances with the Garamantes and other desert tribes, a network of gifts and threats designed to keep the caravan routes open and the frontier quiet. This reveals a crucial adaptation of the borderland principle. In the face of an environment as extreme as the Sahara, even Rome, history's most determined empire builder, had to change its playbook. Direct rule was impossible, so it practiced a form of remote control, exerting influence rather than imposing administration. The Garamantes, in turn, thrived in this interstitial space. Their power was built on controlling the flows between worlds, on mastering the very emptiness that stopped empires in their tracks. They were the gatekeepers of the sand, proof that a borderland was not always a place of poverty or isolation, but could be the center of its own rich and sophisticated world, forever just beyond the reach of the imperial map. This pattern of influence without conquest would become a recurring theme, but as we look east, we find an empire that seemed to break all the old rules, conquering the very steppes that had defied others for millennia. Yet no landscape tested the limits of settled power more profoundly than the endless sea of grass to the east. The Eurasian steppe was not a borderland in the traditional sense. It was an entire world in motion, a geographic realm that operated by rules completely alien to the empires that fringed its edges. From the Great Wall of China to the Danube River in Europe, this vast corridor of open grassland represented the ultimate imperial nightmare. The core of the conflict was a fundamental mismatch in how societies were built. The empires were sedentary, agrarian, and centralized. Their strength came from fixed cities, cultivated fields, and a bureaucratic hierarchy that collected taxes and raised armies. The steppe nomads, in contrast, were hypermobile, decentralized, and pastoral. Their wealth was on the hoof, their homes were felt tents mounted on wagons, and their entire social structure was built around movement and adaptability. An emperor in his palace could command 1 million subjects, but he could not command the grass to stop growing or the seasons to change. the very rhythms that dictated the nomads' lives. This created a cyclical pattern of interaction that repeated for thousands of years, a frustrating dance of raid and response. Nomadic confederations, from the Scythians and Xiongnu to the later Huns and Mongols, would launch lightning raids into settled territory. Riding hardy steppe ponies, they could strike without warning, targeting undefended villages, seizing grain, silks, and captives, then vanishing back into the trackless expanse before a provincial army could even be mustered. The imperial response was almost always the same and almost always futile. A punitive expedition would be launched, a magnificent army marching out from its walled cities to teach the barbarians a lesson. But in the steppe, there was nothing to besiege, no supply lines to cut, and often no enemy to find. The nomads would simply retreat deeper, drawing the overburdened imperial force into a logistical quagmire where supply wagons ran dry and morale collapsed. The land itself was the nomads' greatest ally. Occasionally, out of sheer exhaustion or fear, the empire would switch tactics. Instead of sending an army, it would send treasure. This was the system of reverse taxation, where the settled civilization would pay lavish tribute, silk, grain, and precious metals, to the steppe leaders in exchange for a temporary peace. It was a humbling admission that it was cheaper to buy the nomads' goodwill than to defeat them. But this, too, was only a pause. The underlying dynamic remained, and when a charismatic leader united the tribes, that temporary nuisance could explode into a cataclysm. The arrival of the Huns in Europe or the Mongol invasions under Genghis Khan were not mere raids. They were the steppe borderland asserting its power on a continental scale, demonstrating that the periphery could, in a heartbeat, become the terrifying center. For the sedentary empires, the steppe was a permanent strategic paradox, a threat that could be managed, bribed, or feared, but could never be erased from the map or the imperial imagination. This pattern of defiant highlands finds its most potent and enduring example in the sun-baked, jagged heart of Central Asia. The Afghan highlands, a sprawling complex of mountains centered on the Hindu Kush, are not just a place on a map, they are a historical phenomenon. For over 2 millennia, this region has earned a sobering title, the Graveyard of Empires. It stands as the ultimate borderland, a zone where the ambitions of the world's greatest powers have consistently shattered against a relentless combination of rock and human resilience. The story begins with one of history's most celebrated conquerors, Alexander the Great, leading his battle-hardened Macedonian army eastward after defeating the Persian Empire, arrived here expecting another victory. He faced not a unified kingdom, but a mosaic of fiercely independent tribes and city-states in a region then known as Bactria and Sogdiana. Alexander did win his battles. His military genius was undeniable, but securing the land was a different matter entirely. The campaigns here were among the most brutal and costly of his entire march. He faced constant rebellions, guerrilla attacks from mountain strongholds, and a political landscape that shifted like the desert wind. He resorted to founding cities and marrying a local princess, Roxana, in an attempt to build bridges, but his control remained fragile, reliant on his personal presence. The moment his successors, the Seleucid Empire, took over, the highlands began to slip from their grasp, reasserting their traditional autonomy. The formula for resistance here is a perfect storm of 3 elements. First, the extreme topography. The Hindu Kush is a brutal labyrinth of soaring, snow-capped peaks, deep, narrow valleys, and high passes that become death traps in winter. This terrain negates the advantages of a traditional imperial army. Large formations cannot maneuver, supply lines are impossibly vulnerable, and there is no single geographic heart to capture. An invader can seize a valley, only to be fired upon from the ridges above. Second, the social structure. Afghan society has historically been organized around kinship and tribe, not a centralized state. Loyalty flows first to the family, then the clan, then the local valley, making a unified national surrender almost impossible. You might defeat one tribe and force a truce, but the next valley over remains a sovereign, hostile land. This fragmentation means there is no single king to capture, no capital to fall, and thus no decisive end to a conflict. Finally, these highlands are not an isolated island. They sit at the crossroads of Asia, a fact that has consistently provided external support networks. Whether it was rival empires seeking to bleed a competitor by supporting the tribes, or later, global powers during the Cold War, the Highlanders have often found outside resources to prolong their fight. This combination proved devastating to modern empires as well. In the 19th century, the British Empire, at the height of its global power, fought two disastrous wars in Afghanistan, attempting to secure its northwestern frontier in India. They marched in with disciplined regiments, won conventional engagements, and even installed friendly rulers in Kabul, but they could not hold the country. Their supply columns were ambushed in the passes, their garrison towns became isolated targets, and the political alliances they built evaporated as soon as their back was turned. The retreat from Kabul in 1842 became one of the most infamous military disasters in British history, with an entire army of over 16,000 soldiers and camp followers wiped out by tribal forces and the brutal winter. Over a century later, the Soviet Union, a superpower with immense mechanized forces, repeated the era. They invaded in 1979 to prop up a communist government. For 10 years, they controlled the cities and the major roads by day, but the mountains and the countryside belonged to the Mujahideen resistance. Using guerrilla tactics, supplied with weapons from external powers, the fighters turned the highlands into a quagmire that drained Soviet resources and morale. The USSR could win any set-piece battle, but it could not win the war because the war was not for territory. It was for the allegiance of a people whose social fabric was impervious to foreign ideology. In each case, from Alexander to the Soviets, the outcome was the same. Imperial armies could achieve tactical victory, but they consistently failed at the strategic goal of establishing lasting, self-sustaining political control. The Highlands absorbed their force, exhausted their will, and ultimately expelled them, leaving behind only scars and legends. This place teaches us that in a true borderland, military power alone is a tool with severe limits. It can break things, but it cannot build a lasting peace on a foundation of fractured stone and deeper, older loyalties. But the story of untamed highlands and their precious secrets did not end in Afghanistan. Far to the southwest, where the Arabian Peninsula meets the sea, another range of mountains held a treasure more valuable than gold to the ancient world. The rugged highlands of Yemen, baked by a fierce sun and carved by deep valleys known as wadis, were the sole source of two legendary substances, frankincense and myrrh. These aromatic resins, harvested from scraggly trees that grew only in this specific soil and climate, were not mere luxuries. In the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, they were essentials, burned in every temple ritual, used in embalming practices, and prized as the ultimate symbols of wealth and divinity. This gave the tribes of the Yemeni interior a power far beyond their numbers. They controlled not a strategic pass, but the very source of a spiritual and economic commodity that empires desperately needed. Great powers lapped at the edges of this region for centuries. The Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, with its vast fleets, sought to dominate the trade routes. Later, the Roman Empire, under the Emperor Augustus, launched a major military expedition into Arabia Felix, as they called it, hoping to find the source of this wealth and cut out the middlemen. The Roman campaign was a disaster. The legions, accustomed to the forests of Europe or the deserts of the Near East, were utterly unprepared for the harsh, waterless terrain of the peninsula's interior. They suffered immensely from heat, thirst, and constant harassment by mobile tribal forces who knew every canyon and oasis. The expedition turned back in failure, having never reached the true incense groves. This failure established a pattern that would last for generations. External powers could, and did, exert control over the coastal ports. The magnificent harbor of Aden, for instance, became a cosmopolitan hub where goods from India, Africa, and the interior were traded. A foreign power could garrison such a port, tax the goods moving through it, and influence the merchant princes in the coastal cities. But the moment they looked inland, toward the jagged mountains where the incense trees actually grew, their power evaporated. The highland tribes organized into resilient kingdoms like Saba, home of the biblical queen of Sheba, and later Himyar, were the masters of production. They controlled the arduous process of tapping the trees, collecting the resin, and transporting it along protected caravan routes down to the coast. Their autonomy was their leverage. They could negotiate prices, play rival empires against each other, and if pressed too hard, simply restrict the flow of incense, sending economic and religious shockwaves through distant capitals. So while the map might show a Roman or Ptolemaic sphere of influence along the coastline, the true power, the source of the magic, remained firmly in the hands of the mountain dwellers. It was a perfect borderland equation. Geography plus a monopoly on a priceless resource created a fortress of independence that no fleet or legion could ever breach. The rugged spine of the Balkan Peninsula presented a challenge that outlasted an empire itself. For both Rome and its eastern successor, Byzantium, the mountainous interior of modern Serbia, Bosnia, and Montenegro was not a quiet province but a perpetually simmering frontier, a borderland problem that refused to be solved across 1,000 years of history. The geography was a natural fortress. Dense forests of oak and beech covered steep, folded mountains, while swift rivers carved deep gorges that channeled movement into easily defended passes. This was the ancient homeland of the Illyrians, fierce tribes who had tested Roman arms for centuries before their eventual, and always uneasy, incorporation. Even under the famous Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, this region never fully settled. The imperial model of control relied on cities, roads, and agricultural estates, a network that clung to the coastlines and major river valleys. But in the highland interior, Roman culture remained a thin veneer. Local chieftains often maintained their influence, and the old ways persisted in the isolated valleys far from the gaze of provincial governors. This set the stage for a recurring cycle. A tribe or region would offer a formal, nominal submission to imperial authority, often after a military campaign or in exchange for gifts and titles. They might even provide auxiliary troops for the Roman army, but this loyalty was conditional and local. The moment the central government showed weakness, whether from a distant civil war or a pressing threat on another frontier, the Highlands would erupt. Chieftains would reassert their independence, tolls would be levied on Roman roads, and imperial tax collectors would find the mountain trails suddenly very dangerous. For Rome, and later for Byzantium in Constantinople, this meant the Balkans were never a source of quiet strength. Instead, they were a constant drain, requiring the expensive, repeated deployment of legions and thematic armies, not to conquer new lands, but simply to reassert a control that was always slipping away. This cycle became catastrophic as new peoples moved into this fractured landscape. From the 6th and 7th centuries onward, Slavic tribes migrated into the Balkan interior, finding in its mountains a perfect sanctuary. They blended with the remaining Illyrian and Romanized populations, adopting the very terrain that had defied empire for so long. To the Byzantine emperors, these Slavic groups became a labyrinthine puzzle. They were not a single enemy with a king to defeat, but a constellation of small, mobile communities called sclavoniae. Subduing them was like trying to grasp water. A Byzantine army could march in, burn a few villages, and accept oaths of fealty. but as soon as the army departed to face a Persian threat in the east or an Arab fleet in the Mediterranean, the Slavic tribes would simply return to their autonomous ways. The mountains sheltered them, fed them, and fragmented imperial power. Every emperor in Constantinople knew that securing the Balkan interior was essential to protecting the capital itself, yet the cost of doing so was prohibitive. It locked down military resources that were desperately needed elsewhere, slowly bleeding the empire from within. This highland borderland taught a brutal lesson in imperial overstretch, proving that some territories, by their very nature, consume more than they ever give back. So what forces exactly create these permanent holes in the map of power? Scholars have long debated the root cause, and their theories fall into two compelling camps, one focused on the land itself, and the other on the people who live upon it. The first argument is one of pure, hard geography. It suggests that certain landscapes are simply engineered by nature to resist conquest. Think of a mountain range not as a beautiful vista, but as a colossal, pre-built fortress. Its high peaks act as natural watchtowers, its narrow passes become perfect kill zones for ambushes, and its sheer, rocky slopes break up invading formations into vulnerable, isolated groups. But the defensive power of such terrain goes far beyond the battlefield. It creates what historians call a tyranny of distance and logistics. An empire's strength is its ability to project power, to move men, material, and information over vast distances in a reliable, predictable way. Mountains, deserts, and steppes sabotage that system at every turn. A supply wagon that can travel 20 miles a day on a Roman road might cover only 2 miles in a steep, winding mountain pass. In a desert, that same wagon requires enormous reserves of water just for the animals pulling it, turning every expedition into a desperate race against thirst. These environments impose a brutal tax on ambition, draining imperial treasuries and morale long before a decisive victory can be won. Furthermore, this rugged geography inherently favors a decentralized way of fighting. There is no single, open plain where a large imperial army can bring its full force to bear. Instead, the land is fractured into 100 small valleys or 1,000 shifting dunes, a perfect setting for guerrilla tactics. A local defender doesn't need to defeat the empire's army. They only need to survive it, to harass its supply lines, and to outlast its political will to stay. In this view, the borderland persists because the landscape provides a permanent, unbreakable shield. It is the ultimate defender, ensuring that the cost of conquest will always, inevitably, exceed any possible reward. But geography alone cannot tell the whole story. A second, equally powerful theory argues that the true secret lies not in the rocks and rivers, but in the social fabric of the people who call these places home. The empires that repeatedly failed in these zones were, at their core, bureaucracies. They thrived on order, on census lists, on fixed addresses, and on a clear chain of command leading back to a capital city. The societies they encountered in the borderlands operated on a completely different logic. These were often clan-based or tribal societies, where the primary loyalty was to family, kinship group, or a local chieftain, not to a distant emperor or an abstract idea of a state. This social structure is a nightmare for imperial administration. There is no single king to capture, no central capital whose fall means surrender. If you defeat one clan, the next valley over remains a sovereign, hostile land untouched by your victory. These societies were also frequently mobile, whether they were steppe herders following their flocks or desert tribes moving between oases. Mobility is the ultimate political defense. You cannot tax what you cannot find, you cannot conscript men who have vanished into a trackless waste, and you cannot impose your laws on a community that literally moves away from your officials. This creates a fundamental mismatch of scale. An empire is built to govern large, stationary populations. It is a heavyweight boxer, powerful and disciplined, but facing a swarm of agile, evasive opponents who refused to stand still and trade blows. The empire's tools, its tax rolls, its legal codes, its standardized weights and measures, are useless against a society that organizes itself around oral tradition, reciprocal gift-giving, and fluid alliances. From this perspective, the borderland is not just a physical space, but a social and cultural one. It persists because the very way of life cultivated there is incompatible with, and resistant to, the centralizing, homogenizing force of empire. The land may provide the stage, but it is the enduring, adaptable culture of its people that writes the script of defiance. This brings us to a pivotal question, one that bridges these two great theories. If both the land and its people are so perfectly designed to resist, how did any empire ever manage to exert even temporary influence in these zones at all? The answer lies not in the blunt instrument of conquest, but in a far more subtle and ancient art. The key to this enduring defiance lies in a fundamental mismatch of strategy, a concept we might call the asymmetry of power. In a true borderland, the empire and the local society were not playing the same game, and they were not using the same rulebook. For the great civilizations, warfare was ultimately a political and economic tool, a means to secure resources, expand territory, and demonstrate glory. Victory was measured in captured cities, subdued kings, and new provinces added to the map. To achieve this, they perfected the art of the set-piece battle, where disciplined formations and superior numbers could crush an enemy army in a single, decisive afternoon. But in the mountains, the desert, or the steppe, there was no enemy army to crush, at least not in the way the empire understood it. Borderland societies mastered a different form of conflict entirely, one designed not to win a grand battle, but to never lose the war. Their strategy was built on evasion, harassment, and endurance. They would not mass their fighters on an open plain to be slaughtered by a legion or a cavalry charge. Instead, they relied on lightning raids, striking imperial supply caravans, isolated outposts, or undefended villages on the frontier's edge. They perfected the ambush, using their knowledge of the terrain to lure overconfident imperial patrols into narrow gorges or forest trails where their numerical advantage meant nothing. And when faced with an overwhelming advance, they might even employ scorched earth tactics, destroying their own modest crops and poisoning wells before retreating deeper into their sanctuary, leaving the invading army to occupy a worthless, barren landscape. This created an impossible dilemma for the imperial commander. To have any hope of success, he needed to deploy overwhelming force, a vast army with all its support personnel, to sweep the region and hopefully force a submission. But maintaining such a force in an unproductive borderland was economically catastrophic. Every soldier camped in a highland valley was a soldier not guarding a richer, more vital province. The grain consumed by his army had to be shipped in at immense cost over terrible roads, a drain on the imperial treasury that yielded little in return. The local economy, often based on herding or limited terrace farming, could not support such a parasitic presence, so the empire faced a brutal choice, a ruinous expense or an ineffective presence. A large army would bankrupt the campaign before it achieved lasting results, while a small, permanent garrison would be isolated, vulnerable, and constantly bled by the very raids it was meant to prevent. This is the core of the asymmetric struggle. The empire needed a quick, decisive victory to make the effort worthwhile, but the borderland society only needed to survive to outlast the imperial will. They turned time itself into a weapon. Every season the imperial army remained in the field was a victory for the defenders, a slow draining of resources and political capital back in the distant capital. The asymmetry made conquest not just difficult but fundamentally unsustainable, a lesson written not in the glory of a single battle, but in the quiet, grinding exhaustion of 100 forgotten campaigns. This relentless asymmetry points to a deeper, more fundamental truth about why these borderlands endured. At its heart, every empire is an economic project. Its armies, its roads, its bureaucracies all serve a single, overriding purpose: to extract surplus, to draw more wealth into the center than is spent projecting power outward. Conquest is not an end in itself, it is an investment, and like any investment, it requires a positive return. This simple economic calculus is the hidden ruler that drew the final, unyielding lines on the ancient map. For a civilization considering an expansion, the decision was brutally pragmatic. Officials would weigh the anticipated gains of a new territory, its potential for taxation, its mineral wealth, its agricultural yield, or its population available for labor or military service, against the staggering costs of taking and holding it. Those costs included the immediate expense of the military campaign itself, feeding and paying thousands of soldiers for months or years. But the real burden was the long-term one, the price of permanent occupation, building and manning a network of forts, administering a resistant population, and maintaining supply lines over hostile terrain. In many of the borderlands we have explored, this equation never added up. The Zagros Mountains might have some timber and metals, but extracting them would require securing every valley and pass from constant raiding, a garrison so large it would consume the very profits it was meant to protect. The Scottish Highlands offered little arable land and no known precious resources to justify the cost of legions shivering on the edge of the known world. The Sahara's value lay in trade routes, but controlling those routes did not require conquering the entire desert, only influencing its gateways. When the projected cost of full integration consistently exceeded the expected revenue, the empire's strategy shifted. It abandoned the dream of direct rule and settled for a different, cheaper form of influence: loose hegemony. This was not control, but a negotiated dominance. The empire might demand a symbolic submission, a formal oath of loyalty from a local chieftain, often given in exchange for lavish gifts, titles, or trading privileges. They might station a small diplomatic mission or a token military force in a cooperative client kingdom. The borderland society, in turn, would promise not to raid imperial territory, to provide auxiliary troops when called, and to allow trade to flow. But crucially, they governed themselves. Their internal laws, their social structures, their daily lives remained their own. This arrangement was a compromise that served both sides. The empire secured its frontier at a fraction of the cost of a war of conquest and a permanent occupation. It gained a buffer zone against more distant threats and access to trade goods, like incense from Yemen or horses from the steppe, without the headache of managing production. The borderland society maintained its cherished autonomy, its way of life intact, while gaining prestige, protection, and profitable commercial links with a powerful neighbor. This economic logic explains why the map of ancient control looks the way it does. Those stubborn blank spaces were not necessarily the strongest military challenges, though they were that too. They were, more precisely, the places where the balance sheet of empire finally went into the red. They were the bad investments, the territories where ambition was ultimately checked not by a lack of courage, but by a cold, clear calculation of cost and benefit. The land and its people made the price of admission too high, and so the empires, for all their grandeur, learned to stop at the door. This economic calculation, however, overlooks the human spirit's most potent fuel. Beyond the balance sheets of grain and silver, the true engine of the borderland was an idea, a powerful sense of identity forged in the crucible of perpetual defiance. For generations, the people living in these zones did not see themselves as subjects waiting for a master, but as guardians of a way of life that was constantly under threat. This prolonged state of resistance did more than shape battle tactics, it sculpted a collective soul. Their identity became defined, in large part, in opposition to the imperial other. To the Highlander, the empire was not a bringer of civilization, but a distant, greedy force from the flatlands that demanded submission and upended ancient traditions. This clear dichotomy, us versus them, was a powerful unifying force. It smoothed over internal disputes and forged a common purpose that could be passed from parent to child, a story of resilience told around countless fires. This story was often codified in myth and legend, becoming a cultural bedrock. Tales of heroic ancestors who defied great kings, or of gods who blessed their mountains and deserts as sacred, free spaces, were not mere entertainment. They were a moral and historical curriculum. They taught each new generation who they were, why their struggle mattered, and that their independence was a sacred trust inherited from the past. In the Caucasus, epic poetry celebrated warrior heroes and their codes of honor. In the Scottish Highlands, clan sagas reinforced kinship loyalty and a deep connection to the glens. These narratives created a shared memory that was stronger than any imperial decree, offering a template for how to be and how to resist. This cultivated a pervasive culture of warrior independence. For a young man in such a society, status and respect were not earned through bureaucratic service or paying taxes to a far-off capital. They were won through bravery in raids, skill in arms, and steadfastness in protecting the community. This social system made the prospect of peaceful assimilation deeply unappealing. Even when an empire applied immense military pressure and managed to install a cooperative local ruler, this cultural undercurrent remained. The imperial collaborator might enjoy titles and wealth, but he often faced suspicion or even open rebellion from his own people, who saw his compliance as a betrayal of their core identity. The empire might control the forts and the roads, but it rarely controlled the stories people told in their homes. This intangible fortress of ideology and identity meant that military victory alone could never truly end the conflict. You could scatter an army, but you could not erase a song. You could occupy a valley, but you could not occupy a people's sense of themselves as inherently free. This made assimilation, the dream of turning defiant borderlanders into loyal imperial subjects, a near impossibility. The resistance was not just a political or military stance. It was woven into the very fabric of what it meant to belong. And as we have seen, this powerful sense of self did not exist in a vacuum. It was a direct response to a specific, recurring imperial strategy, one that often sought to break that spirit not just with swords, but with a far more subtle and pervasive tool: cultural influence and integration. Faced with this impossible equation, empires developed a sophisticated workaround. If they could not conquer the borderland, they would try to rent its loyalty. The result was one of antiquity's most enduring and delicate political instruments, the client state. This was not a province governed by an imperial official, but a nominally independent kingdom or tribal confederation on the very edge of imperial territory, bound to the empire by a web of personal and political ties. The arrangement was a masterpiece of pragmatic diplomacy. An emperor or his general would identify a powerful local chiant, someone with influence over a key mountain valley or a critical desert oasis. To this leader, the empire would offer a compelling package. It might include a formal title, perhaps king or friend of Rome, inscribed on a bronze tablet and delivered with great ceremony. There would be lavish gifts, subsidies of gold and grain, and promises of military support against the client's local rivals. Sometimes, to seal the bond, a marriage alliance was arranged, weaving the imperial family's lineage into the local dynasty. In return, the client ruler swore an oath of loyalty. He promised to keep the peace along his stretch of the frontier, to deny sanctuary to the empire's enemies, and to provide auxiliary troops for the imperial army when called. For the empire, the benefits were immense and cost-effective. Instead of spending a fortune to garrison 100 miles of rugged frontier, they could subsidize a single cooperative king and let him handle security with his own people in their own way. The client state acted as a living buffer, absorbing the first shock of any disturbance from beyond the frontier and providing valuable intelligence about movements in the deeper borderland. It was empire by remote control, a way to project influence without the crippling expense of direct administration. Yet this system was inherently, profoundly unstable. Its success hinged entirely on the loyalty and capability of one individual, the client ruler, and that ruler was forever walking a tightrope. To the empire, he was a useful ally. But to his own people, he could easily be seen as a collaborator, a traitor who had traded their hard-won autonomy for foreign gold and fancy titles. A younger, more militant faction within the tribe or kingdom might agitate for a return to the old ways of raiding and independence, viewing the imperial subsidies not as a reward, but as a form of tribute they were forcing from a weak and distant power. This internal pressure could force a client king's hand. To prove he had not gone soft, he might need to stage a symbolic raid across the border, or suddenly renegotiate the terms of his alliance, demanding more gold for the same promises. Worse, if a rival empire appeared on the opposite horizon offering a better deal, the client's allegiance could switch overnight. The history of the Roman East is filled with such volatile relationships. King Herod the Great in Judea, for instance, was a masterful client ruler for Rome, but his hold on power relied entirely on Roman backing amidst a deeply divided and resentful population. In the Caucasus, Armenian kings would pivot between allegiance to Rome and Persia, depending on which emperor offered the most compelling mix of threats and rewards at any given moment. The client-state system thus created a permanent low-grade fever on the frontier. It prevented all-out war, but it required constant maintenance, a never-ending flow of diplomatic envoys, gift-giving ceremonies, and occasional shows of force to remind clients of their commitments. It was a tense, negotiated peace, always one ambitious heir or one popular uprising away from collapsing back into the familiar chaos of the borderland. This delicate dance reveals the ultimate limit of imperial power. It could buy influence, but it could rarely buy the one thing it truly needed, the unwavering loyalty of a land and people built on defiance. The client-state system was a fragile, living negotiation, but sometimes an empire needed a line that was set in stone. When the cost of managing a restless borderland became too high, even for diplomacy, civilizations turned to their most spectacular and enduring adaptation, the fortified frontier. These were not temporary fieldworks, but colossal, permanent statements etched across the landscape. From the rolling hills of northern Britain to the wind-swept deserts of North Africa and the mountainous spine of China, empires built walls. But to see these structures as simple defensive barriers is to miss their deeper, more revealing purpose. They were monumental admissions of a strategic limit, the physical embodiment of an empire's decision to stop. A wall like Hadrian's in Britain or the Great Wall of China does not proclaim we are expanding. It declares, here is where our expansion ends. It is the ultimate compromise, a way to manage a problem that could not be solved through conquest or client kings. By investing mountains of labor and treasure into a fixed, linear barrier, an empire was making the borderland official, formalizing it as a permanent interface rather than a temporary frontier. The function of these massive projects was always twofold, a combination of military logic and economic control. Militarily, they were designed to deter, delay, and channel movement. A stone wall studded with forts and watchtowers forced anyone crossing to do so at designated gates, under the watchful eyes of garrison soldiers. It turned an open, fluid border zone into a controlled checkpoint, making large-scale raids infinitely more difficult. A nomadic warband could not simply sweep across the steppe. It now had to breach a physical obstacle or funnel itself into a killing zone at a fortified gate. This gave the defending empire crucial time to muster a response, but perhaps more importantly, these walls were instruments of regulation, not exclusion. They were as much about managing peaceful interaction as preventing violent invasion. Every major gatehouse was also a customs station. The Roman limes in the Syrian desert, for instance, was not an impenetrable curtain, but a chain of forts that monitored and taxed the caravan trade. The Great Wall of China had massive gates like the famous Jiayu Pass, which served as bustling market towns where Silk Road merchants would pay duties, have their goods inspected, and acquire safe passage permits. The wall did not stop trade, it bureaucratized it. It transformed the chaotic, unpredictable flow of people and goods across the borderland into a controlled, taxable stream. In this way, the fortified frontier formalized the very existence of the independent zone beyond it. It created a clear inside and outside. Inside was the empire, the realm of law, taxes, and imperial administration. Outside was the borderland, a space of different rules, different loyalties, and different ways of life. The wall was the acknowledgement that the outside could not be made into the inside, at least not at a bearable cost. So instead of wasting lives and treasure in a futile war of conquest, the empire chose to build a gigantic filter, allowing what was beneficial, like trade and information, to pass through while straining out what was threatening, like armies and large-scale raids. This was control through architecture, an attempt to bring order to the inherent chaos of the borderland by literally drawing a line in the sand or in the stone. It was a brilliant, if brutally expensive, adaptation. Yet for all their imposing grandeur, these stone sentinels could not change the fundamental reality of the lands they faced. They were a magnificent containment strategy, not a solution. And as history would show, the most profound adaptations often occurred not in stone and mortar, but in the very minds and institutions of the empires themselves, leading to a quieter, more pervasive form of influence that sought to conquer not territory but identity. But the walls and the client kingdoms represented a tense, unstable equilibrium. For centuries, the great civilizations could maintain this careful balance, managing the borderland as a controlled pressure valve. Yet history holds a sobering lesson about any system built on containment. When the core weakens, the periphery does not simply remain quiet, it can become an active agent of destruction. The borderlands, those zones of perpetual defiance, were not merely holes in the map, they were reservoirs of pent-up energy, and in moments of imperial crisis, that energy could burst forth with catastrophic force. The very traits that made these societies unconquerable, their mobility, their warrior culture, their deep resilience, became the precise tools that could unravel an empire from its edges inward. This is the collapse catalyst, the moment the borderland strikes back. Consider the final centuries of the Roman Empire in the West. For generations, the Rhine and Danube rivers, fortified by the limes, had marked a stable frontier. Beyond them lived a mosaic of Germanic tribes, from the Franks and Alemanni to the Goths and Vandals. Roman policy had long managed these groups through a mix of military deterrence, subsidized alliances, and controlled settlement within the empire as auxiliary troops. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, a perfect storm of internal strain hit Rome. Political instability saw emperors rising and falling in quick succession, often at the point of a sword in distant civil wars. Economic troubles mounted, and the sheer administrative weight of the empire began to creak. From the perspective of a tribal leader watching from across the river, the mighty empire suddenly looked distracted, divided, and vulnerable. The pressure from beyond the frontier intensified, driven in part by larger population movements further east, like the arrival of the Huns. But the critical factor was the erosion of Roman strength at the center. The legions were pulled back from the frontiers to fight each other, leaving the great border defenses thinly held. The system of client subsidies broke down as treasuries emptied. The careful balance of power shattered. What happened next was not a single invasion but a flood. In the winter of 406, the Rhine frontier, weakened by troop withdrawals, froze solid. Huge confederations of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the ice not as raiders, but as entire peoples on the move with their families, wagons, and herds. They met little organized resistance. This was not a battle lost, it was a border system failing completely. Once inside, these groups did not aim to conquer the empire in the old style, to replace the emperor and administer the provinces. They moved through the landscape, seeking land and security, carving out their own kingdoms in Roman territory, from North Africa to Spain to Gaul. The Western Roman state, its resources exhausted and its legitimacy crumbling, could not muster an effective response. The borderland had ceased to be a frontier, it had become a highway, and the societies Rome had spent centuries managing from a position of strength now became the architects of its dissolution. The limes, that magnificent symbol of imperial limit, became the very conduit through which collapse flowed. The same pattern unfolded with chilling symmetry on the other side of the world. The Great Wall of China, that staggering feat of engineering, was built to manage the eternal threat from the northern steppes. For dynasties like the Han and the Tang, the wall was part of a sophisticated strategy combining military garrisons, tribute payments to nomadic chieftains, and trade at regulated frontier markets. It worked so long as the Chinese state was unified, prosperous, and militarily vigilant. But Chinese history cycles through periods of dynastic strength and decay. When a dynasty entered its twilight, plagued by court corruption, peasant rebellions, and financial crisis, the northern frontier invariably grew porous. The steppe nomads, whether the Xiongnu, the Mongols, or the Manchus, were astute observers of this internal weakness. The wall itself was not always breached by force, though it could be. More often, the breakdown was systemic. Garrisons went unpaid and deserted. Frontier generals declared their own independence, and the coordinated defense that made the wall effective simply fell apart. In these windows of profound vulnerability, the nomadic reservoir of power would overflow. The most famous example is the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, but the principle is older. During the collapse of the Han dynasty in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, nomadic cavalry played a key role in the warlord conflicts that tore the north apart, not as the primary cause, but as a decisive accelerant. They were invited in as mercenaries by rival Chinese factions, or they exploited the chaos to establish their own rule in frontier provinces. The ultimate success of the Manchus in the 17th century, who crossed the wall not as destroyers but as arbiters of a Ming dynasty civil war, shows the same dynamic. A weakened core lost control of its border management tools, and the peripheral force, long contained, stepped into the power vacuum. The borderland did not just resist, it inverted the relationship, moving from the periphery to the center and reshaping the civilization it had once defied. This reveals the borderland's dual nature. In times of imperial strength, it was a zone of costly failure, a drain on resources that forced empires to build walls and broker deals. But in times of imperial weakness, it transformed into something far more potent, a crucible of alternative power. The societies there had spent generations perfecting the arts of war, mobility, and survival under pressure. They were not softened by the luxuries and complex politics of the settled core. When the dam of imperial power finally cracked, these hardened, adaptable forces were perfectly positioned to rush in. They were not the original cause of the collapse, which usually sprang from internal rot, but they were the catalyst that made recovery impossible. They turned a political crisis into a civilizational transformation. The energy that could not be absorbed or destroyed by the empire at its height became the very force that dismantled it in its decline. This cyclical drama of containment and release forces us to ask a final, pivotal question. If these borderlands held such persistent power, did their influence truly vanish with the age of empires, or did they simply evolve, finding new forms in the modern world of nation-states and hard borders? The forces that shaped the ancient borderlands did not vanish with the fall of Rome or the eclipse of Persia. Their echoes resonate powerfully in the political map of our modern world, revealing a startling continuity in the human struggle over space and sovereignty. Look closely at today's globe, and you will see the same stubborn patterns etched across it. The rugged highlands of Afghanistan, the fractured valleys of the Caucasus, and the mountainous territories spanning Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran where Kurdish communities seek greater autonomy. These are not random zones of instability. They are the direct descendants of the unconquerable borderlands we have traced for millennia. They remain profoundly difficult for centralized nation-states to govern, not because of a failure of modern technology or political will, but because the ancient rules still apply. The geography still favors local defenders, the social structures still prioritize clan and kinship over distant capitals, and the sense of a distinct identity, forged in long resistance, still burns brightly. The fundamental tension has never been resolved, it has merely been redrawn with new borders. It is the enduring conflict between the homogenizing force of a central authority, whether an emperor or a modern government, and the resilient pull of regional autonomy. This is not a story of right or wrong, but a recurring theme in how humans organize power across a diverse and challenging planet. The landscape and the deep-seated cultural identities it nurtures create realities that political maps often struggle to contain. Modern states, with their armies, bureaucracies, and ideologies, have achieved levels of integration unimaginable to ancient empires. Yet in these specific regions, the project of central control remains a perpetual, often fragile, negotiation. The state may build roads and schools, but it must still account for local codes of honor, the authority of tribal elders, and the memory of past defiance. This ongoing dynamic suggests that the borderland is not an archaic concept, but a permanent feature of our political landscape. It challenges the very idea that the map can ever be fully settled, reminding us that human loyalty and the land itself will always have the final word in the story of who controls what and for how long. So these persistent zones of defiance were not historical accidents. They were not the result of weak rulers or unlucky campaigns. The pattern we have traced from the Anatolian highlands to the Afghan passes reveals something far more profound. The repeated failure of empires to control these borderlands stemmed from inherent structural challenges that no amount of military might could permanently overcome. Geography provided an unbreakable shield, while social structures built on kinship and mobility created societies that were fundamentally ungovernable by distant capitals. The economic logic of empire itself drew the final line where the cost of conquest always outweighed any possible gain. These lands were not passive backwaters waiting to be absorbed. They were active, powerful historical agents. By their very existence, they tested the reach of imperial administration. They shaped military strategy and diplomatic practice for centuries, and they ultimately defined the outer limits of what was possible for the ancient world's greatest civilizations. They forced empires to adapt, to build walls, to broker deals, and to accept that some spaces would forever remain just beyond the edge of the map. What does this enduring pattern teach us? It suggests that true power is not simply about the ability to conquer, but about the capacity to sustain control. And it reveals that resistance, when woven into the fabric of a landscape and a culture, can become a force as shaping as any empire. The story of these ancient borderlands invites us to look at our own world with new eyes. Where do we see similar dynamics playing out today, where geography and identity challenge the lines on a modern map? What other historical examples come to your mind where a people and their land wrote a different story than the one intended by a great power? The conversation continues below.